should have never gone to that village. I was a graduate student researching ancient folk rituals in remote European communities, particularly those untouched by modernity. My advisor had mentioned a place deep in the Carpathian Mountains, a village so isolated it barely appeared on maps. Volkovia. Its people spoke an archaic dialect, worshipped strange gods, and, according to the few records I could find, practiced rites older than Christianity itself. It was exactly what I was looking for. My research led me to a half-forgotten journal entry from a 19th-century traveler who had passed through Volkovia. He wrote of the Rite of the Hollow Ones, a bizarre and ominous festival held every few decades. Details were scarce, just whispers of masked figures, bonfires, and something about hollowing out the chosen. The rest of his writings had been burned or torn away, leaving only speculation. I arrived in Volkovia on October 27th. The journey had been grueling. A rusted bus took me from the last town into the mist-choked forest, dropping me off at a dirt path. From there, it was a 3-hour hike through the dense, gnarled trees. When I finally reached the village, I realized how cut off from the world it truly was. There were no power lines, no signs of technology beyond crude farming tools. The villagers, pale, gaunt people with deep-set eyes, watched me with a mix of suspicion and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I had barely set foot in the village when an elderly man, cloaked in furs, approached me. He introduced himself as Father Dimitru, the town's spiritual leader. "You should leave," he said in heavily accented English. "This is not a place for outsiders." I explained my research, showing him the notes I had gathered on their ancient customs. At the mention of the Rite of the Hollow Ones, his face darkened. "Where did you hear of that?" I hesitated, but then admitted the truth. He sighed, glancing around at the other villagers who had gathered. They were listening. "The rite is sacred and dangerous." He stared at me for a long moment. "If you stay, you must not interfere. You must not ask questions." I agreed, eager for the opportunity to witness something truly ancient. He gave me a hard look before turning away. As I settled into the small wooden hut they had prepared for me, I felt a creeping unease. The silence of the village was unnatural. There were no dogs barking, no sounds of children playing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That night, I watched from my window as the villagers gathered in the square. They were preparing. Strange, twisted effigies of faceless figures were erected. Small, carved masks were placed at doorsteps. The air smelled of burnt herbs and something metallic, like blood. I knew, without a doubt, that I was about to witness something that had not been seen by outsiders in centuries. But I had no idea how much I would regret it. The night before the ritual, I barely slept. The silence of Volkovia wasn't just unsettling, it was oppressive. I felt as though the very air was pressing down on me, urging me to leave. But I stayed. On the morning of October 28th, the village was transformed. Effigies of faceless, emaciated figures loomed over the square, their twisted forms made of sticks and bones, their hollowed-out eye sockets staring into nothing. Every door had a mask nailed to it, crudely carved wooden faces, each one unique, depicting expressions of pain, fear, or despair. I walked cautiously through the village, my notebook in hand, documenting everything. No one spoke to me. The villagers moved with quiet purpose, their faces grim as they prepared for something ancient and unspoken. At midday, a low, steady drumming began. It came from the forest, deep, rhythmic beats that made my skin crawl. The villagers froze. Some bowed their heads. Others whispered fervent prayers in a dialect I didn't understand. And then they began to gather in the square. I took my place at the edge of the crowd, heart hammering in my chest as I watched them form a circle around the central bonfire. The flames were black, the smoke curling unnaturally in the air. Father Dimitru stepped forward, draped in a long ceremonial robe embroidered with symbols that made my eyes hurt to look at. He raised his arms, and the drumming ceased. "The Hollow Ones return tonight," he intoned. A collective shudder passed through the crowd. "The offering is prepared," he continued. I expected an animal sacrifice. Perhaps a goat, a cow, maybe even a deer. But I was wrong. Two villagers stepped forward, dragging a young man with them. He couldn't have been older than 20. His hands were bound, his mouth gagged, his eyes wild with terror. He struggled violently, but they held him firm. Panic seized me. This wasn't some symbolic reenactment. This was real. I took a step forward, but a withered old woman beside me gripped my arm. Her nails dug into my flesh, and she shook her head. I was an outsider. I was here to watch, not interfere. Father Dimitru produced a long, jagged blade. And then, before my brain could process what was happening, the blade plunged into the young man's stomach. He let out a muffled scream as the priest carved. Blood gushed onto the dirt. The villagers did not look away. I did. I turned, fighting the bile rising in my throat. I had seen death before, but this was something else. It wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a hollowing. I forced myself to look back just as the priest pulled something out of the young man's body. It was wet, glistening in the firelight. His intestines? His liver? No, it was something else. Something that should not have been inside a human body. The thing squirmed in his hands, long and eel-like, black and slick with blood. The villagers bowed. And then the drumming started again. I realized, with growing horror, that this was just the beginning. I wanted to run. Every primal instinct screamed at me to get out of there, to flee into the night and never look back. But I was frozen, trapped in the moment, unable to comprehend what I had just seen. The thing Father Dimitru had pulled from the young man's body, that writhing, black thing, was not a parasite, not an organ, not anything remotely human. It moved with purpose. And then the priest placed it carefully into a hollowed-out wooden effigy at the center of the square. The faceless figure shuddered. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was seeing things in the flickering firelight. But the villagers saw it too. They gasped, whispered fervently. Some dropped to their knees. The effigy was breathing. The drumming grew louder. I stepped back, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just a ritual. Something was happening. Something that shouldn't be possible. The young man's body twitched. I snapped my gaze back to him, expecting to see lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. But no, his lips were moving, as if whispering something. I felt a hand on my shoulder and nearly screamed. It was Father Dimitru. "You begin to understand," he murmured. I didn't understand anything. What is that?" I gasped, pointing at the thing inside the effigy. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. "We are all born with them," he said. "A second soul. A hollow one." I shook my head, trying to step away, but his grip was firm. "You see, outsider, most people go their entire lives unaware of it. The hollow one stays dormant. But in Volkovia we know the truth. If they are not removed, they grow. They consume." I looked at the villagers, their gaunt faces, their sunken eyes. Had they all undergone this ritual? Had they all been hollowed? "The offering," the priest continued, gesturing to the dying man, "was chosen to ensure the village's survival. Without it, the hollow ones grow restless. They demand more." I turned back to the effigy. The thing inside it was moving more now, stretching against the wooden confines. It pulsed, its form shifting, limbs pressing against the inside of its prison. It was trying to get out. The villagers began to chant. I took another step back, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I had to leave. I had to. The young man suddenly sat up. His body should have been lifeless, bled dry from the ritual. But he turned his head toward me, his mouth opening wide. Too wide. And then, in a voice that did not belong to him, he spoke my name. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran. Through the village, past the masked doors, past the twisted effigies. My boots pounded against the dirt as I sprinted toward the forest. Behind me I heard screams. Not human screams. Something else. Something that had finally been set free. The forest was alive. As I ran, the gnarled trees twisted in the wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The drumming from the village had changed. No longer rhythmic, but erratic, frenzied. I heard voices behind me, chanting in that ancient dialect, growing louder. And then there were other sounds. Things moving in the dark. Not footsteps. Something slithering. I didn't stop. Couldn't. My lungs burned. My legs screamed in protest. But I pushed forward, deeper into the woods. The village was far behind me now, but the sense of something following me only grew stronger. And then I saw the eyes. Dozens of them. Watching from the undergrowth, reflecting the moonlight. I stumbled, nearly falling, but forced myself to keep going. I wasn't alone in these woods. Something whispered my name. I clenched my teeth, refusing to look back. Then the trees ended. I nearly fell forward as the ground abruptly sloped downward into a vast, fog-covered valley. In the distance I saw ruins. Massive, ancient stones arranged in a circle. I had read about these once, pre-Christian altars, places of sacrifice. But this one was wrong. The stones moved, not shifting in the wind, not crumbling with age. They breathed. The whispering grew louder. I turned back toward the forest. And they were there. Not the villagers. Not human. They stood at the tree line, barely visible in the mist. Tall, thin figures draped in black, their faces concealed behind the same wooden masks I had seen in the village. But they were too still, like statues. Then one of them tilted its head. The movement was unnatural, like a puppet with its strings cut. I took a step back, and then another. They stepped forward. Not walking, gliding. I turned and ran toward the ruins. The stones pulsed, their surfaces covered in carvings older than language. The mist swirled around my ankles as I stumbled into the center of the circle. My breath came in ragged gasps. The whispering was everywhere now. Not voices, but thoughts, crawling into my head, pressing against the inside of my skull. I fell to my knees. And then, in the darkness, something opened its eyes. Not in the village. Not in the forest. Beneath me, I realized too late what the hollow ones truly were, and that I had just stepped into their tomb. The earth beneath me shifted. Something deep below stirred, awakened. The ruins, the mist, the very air trembled as the unseen thing opened its eyes. I didn't see them, but I felt them. A presence, vast and ancient, pressing against reality itself. I tried to move, but my body was frozen. The whispering inside my skull was no longer just words. It was a command. Kneel. I did. I didn't want to, but my body obeyed. My head tilted back, my mouth opening on its own. The mist thickened, curling into my lungs, and I felt something crawling into me. I wasn't alone in my skin anymore. A second soul. A hollow one. The realization hit me like ice in my veins. This was what the ritual had been for. Not just for the village, but for the thing beneath me. The hollow ones weren't just parasites. They were pieces of something larger. Something that had been waiting. The masked figures from the forest entered the ruins, surrounding the stone circle. I saw them clearly now. Their masks weren't masks. They had no faces. They had been hollowed completely. Father Dimitru was among them. He stepped forward, lowering his hood. His eyes were gone. His skin stretched tight over an empty skull. And yet, somehow, he still spoke. "You were chosen," he said, his voice a dry rasp. I tried to shake my head, to scream, but no sound came out. "You brought yourself to us," he continued. "You heard the call, and now you will become." The ground beneath me cracked open. A void, endless and yawning, stretched beneath the stones. The mist was pouring from it, the breath of something old. And then I saw it, a shape too large to comprehend, shifting in the blackness. It was rising. The hollow ones around me began to kneel, their arms lifted skyward, their hollow faces turned toward the thing emerging from the earth. And inside me the second soul stirred. I knew with absolute certainty that if I did not fight now, I never would. With every ounce of will I had left, I forced my arm to move, just enough to dig my fingernails into my own skin. The pain was electric, breaking the trance for just a second. I used it. I lunged, scrambling backward out of the circle, my body screaming in protest. The hollow ones turned sharply, as if just realizing I wasn't under their control. I ran. The ruins trembled as the thing below continued to rise. I could hear it, feel it, pressing against my mind. Come back. I didn't stop. I ran through the mist, through the forest, never daring to look behind me. Somehow I made it. I don't remember reaching the road. I don't remember the trip back. But I remember the feeling of emptiness inside me. Like something had almost taken my place. Like it had left a part of itself behind. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whisper. We are waiting. It started with a letter. A crisp, yellowed envelope with no return address slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a single page of handwritten text in old-fashioned cursive. You are the last of your line. The sacrament was never completed. Come home before it is too late. It was signed simply, A.M. I almost threw it away. It had to be a mistake, or some weird prank. But something about the words unsettled me. Because I knew where home was supposed to be. It was Black Hollow, Maine. A town I had spent my entire life avoiding. I had been raised there until I was 6, living in my family's decrepit Victorian house on the edge of town. But then, something happened. I don't remember much, just flashes. My parents whispering in hushed, frantic voices. Candlelight flickering on stone walls. The feeling of cold metal against my forehead. Then darkness. And after that, we left.
No explanaschen. No returning.
My parents never spoke of Black Hollow again, and neither did I. But now both of them were dead. And I was the last of my family. I should have ignored the letter. But I didn't. Black Hollow had not changed. The same looming trees. The same decaying houses sagging under the weight of time. And most of all, the same silence.
No birds. No insects.
Not even the wind. As I drove down the empty streets, I noticed the curtains moving. The townspeople were watching. I caught glimpses of pale faces and sunken eyes, and something else. Something like recognition. They knew me. I finally reached the house at the edge of town. It was exactly as I remembered. The peeling gray paint, the ivy strangling the windows, the massive iron door knocker shaped like an open eye. I hesitated, then grabbed the knocker and slammed it down. The sound echoed unnaturally, rippling through the air like a stone dropped into deep water. Then the door opened on its own. Inside, the house was dark and dust-choked. Furniture draped in white sheets loomed like shrouded figures. The air was thick with the scent of wax and old wood. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me. The letter had said, "Come home before it is too late." Too late for what? I was about to find out. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The house felt alive. Not in the way of a cozy childhood home, full of memories and warmth, but in the way of something that watched. Something that waited. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, disturbed only by my footsteps as I moved deeper inside. The silence was absolute. No creaking floorboards, no wind rattling the old glass windows. It was as if the house had been sealed off from time itself. And then I saw it. On the floor of the grand foyer, partially hidden beneath the dust, was a symbol. A perfect circle carved into the wood, surrounded by smaller, interlocking sigils. Ritual markings. Something about it ached in my memory, like a word on the tip of my tongue. I crouched down, running my fingers over the grooves. Cold. Too cold. The moment my skin touched the carving, a sound ripped through the house. A distant, metallic clanking. Slow, deliberate, coming from below. I turned sharply, heart hammering. The noise had come from the hallway leading to the basement. I swallowed hard. The logical part of me screamed to leave, to drive back to the city and never look back. But the other part, the part that had come here seeking answers, needed to know. The air grew colder as I walked down the narrow corridor. Dust-shrouded portraits lined the walls, their faces half erased by time. But one caught my attention. A woman, dressed in dark ceremonial robes, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow, and beneath the portrait, a brass nameplate. A Montgomery, the initials from the letter. I should have turned back. But instead, I reached for the basement door and pulled it open. A rush of cold, damp air hit me like a slap. The stairs stretched down into utter blackness. And from below I heard it again. Clank, drag, clank. Someone or something was down there. I took a slow, shuddering breath. Then I stepped forward, into the dark. The basement swallowed me in darkness. The air was thick, damp, stale and metallic, like rusted iron and old blood. I gripped the wooden railing, moving slowly down the steps, each footstep kicking up dust that had been undisturbed for decades. And still, from below, I heard it. Clank, drag, clank. Something was moving in the basement. The final step groaned under my weight as I reached the bottom. I fumbled for a light switch, my fingers scraping against rough stone. Nothing. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The weak glow illuminated a vast, cavernous space beneath the house, far larger than the foundation should have allowed. The walls weren't brick or wood. They were carved stone. This wasn't a basement. It was a crypt. I swallowed hard, the beam of my light flickering over symbols etched into the walls. They looked like the ones in the foyer, but older, deeper. Some had been filled with something dark. Dried blood? I took a step forward, my breath clouding in the freezing air. And then I saw it. In the center of the crypt was a stone slab, a crude altar, and someone was lying on it. My breath hitched as my flashlight trembled in my grip. The figure was bound in chains. Their face was obscured by a cloth, but their chest rose and fell. They were alive. My instincts screamed to run, to leave this place, forget everything. But then the figure twitched. Their head turned toward me, and a voice, hoarse and ragged, whispered my name. I nearly dropped my phone. Then, from the shadows beyond the altar, something moved. A shape tall, skeletal, with too many joints. It stepped into the dim light, its skin stretched thin over an impossible frame. It was wearing a mask, a smooth, featureless face of polished bone. My blood turned to ice. The thing tilted its head as if studying me. And then, in a voice far too familiar, it whispered, "The sacrament must be finished." The chains on the altar rattled violently. I turned and ran. But the thing was faster. I ran blindly through the crypt, my flashlight bouncing wildly, the shadows stretching and warping around me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heartbeat hammering in my skull. Behind me I heard it, the clank, drag, clank of chains. And footsteps, too many footsteps. I turned a corner, nearly tripping over the uneven stone floor. The walls around me were closing in, the carved symbols seeming to shift in the dim light, twisting like living things. Then a doorway, a heavy wooden door, half-rotted but open just enough for me to slip through. I lunged for it, shoving my weight against the wood, forcing it closed just as something slammed into it from the other side. The impact rattled my bones. I stumbled back, gripping my phone like a lifeline. My light flickered over the room beyond the door, and I froze. The walls here were lined with coffins. Not the kind you'd find in a cemetery. These were primitive. Wooden boxes reinforced with iron chains, each one marked with the same cryptic symbols I had seen throughout the house. But some of them were broken open. The lids splintered, the chains snapped, as if something had forced its way out. I stepped forward, swallowing back the bile rising in my throat. That's when I saw the portraits. Lining the far wall were paintings. Portraits of people dressed in dark ceremonial robes, their faces gaunt and hollow. Each one had a nameplate. I moved closer, reading the inscriptions beneath the dust. Montgomery, the woman from the portrait upstairs, the one who had sent the letter.
H. Montgomery. El Montgomery.
A Montgomery. The realization struck me like a fist to the gut. These weren't just random names. They were my family. I kept moving, dread pooling in my stomach, until I reached the last portrait. The paint was fresher, the canvas newer, and the nameplate beneath it was mine. My throat went dry, and then the door behind me creaked open. The room filled with a low, wet breathing. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. Then, In a voice that sounded like my own, something whispered behind me. You were never meant to leave. I turned, and the thing wearing my face was standing there. It was me, or something that looked like me. Same eyes, same face, but wrong. Its skin was too pale, stretched too tightly over its skull. Its lips curled slightly, but the expression was empty, hollow, like a mask trying to imitate human emotion. I stepped back, my pulse a violent hammer in my chest. My mind screamed that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. But then it spoke. You left before the sacrament was finished. His voice was my voice. The others paid the price. But you were spared. I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. Took a step forward. But you came back. A slow tilt of the head. That means you're ready. The coffins behind me shifted. Wood groaned. Chains rattled. I turned my head just enough to see something inside one of them. A hand. Pale, long-fingered, gripping the broken edge of the coffin. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just ran. I bolted through the crypt, my flashlight bouncing wildly, shadows twisting and crawling along the walls. Behind me they were waking up, the unfinished ones. I heard them moving, whispering. My name repeated over and over, a chorus of voices too much like my own. I reached the stairway and threw myself up the steps. The wooden door at the top slammed shut before I could reach it. I crashed into it, clawing at the handle. Locked. Something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly, my boot connecting with something soft and brittle. The grip loosened, and I turned to see a hand retreating into the dark. Fingers that looked just like mine. I pounded against the door. Let me out. For the first time, the house responded. The symbols on the walls burned. A deep, thrumming noise filled the air, like a pulse, like the heartbeat of something enormous. And then, the door opened. I stumbled forward, into the foyer. The house groaned, dust raining from the ceiling. The portraits on the walls shifted, watching me. I didn't stop to look. I ran for the front door, grabbed the iron knocker, and yanked it open. Cold night air hit my face. I sprinted down the steps, across the dead grass, throwing myself into my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror I saw the house. The door was still open. And standing in the doorway, me, smiling. I peeled out of the driveway, gravel kicking up behind me, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The house disappeared into the darkness. I drove. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away. But even now, days later, I still feel it. The emptiness inside me, like something is missing, like something is waiting to come back. And sometimes, when I pass by a mirror, for just a split second, I see it smiling. I had never heard of Saint Verina's feast before. It wasn't in any books, and no one outside of Grimstead seemed to know about it. But when my boyfriend Daniel suggested we visit his hometown for the festival, I agreed. He made it sound quaint, mysterious. It's like stepping into another world, he told me. It's been celebrated for centuries, long before the town even had a name. I should have asked more questions. But I didn't. We arrived in Grimstead on October 30th. It was an isolated place, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No cell service.
No streetlights.
Just endless forests pressing in from all sides. The town itself felt wrong. The buildings were old, sagging under the weight of time. The streets were too empty. And the people, they stared. Not in a hostile way. More like they were expecting something. Or someone. Daniel's family welcomed me warmly. But there was something strange in his mother's eyes when she hugged me. Like pity. I ignored it. That night, the festival preparations began. The townspeople decorated the streets with withered branches and old bone charms. They painted their doors with symbols that looked almost runic. And at the center of town, they built the banquet table. A massive wooden table, stretching the entire length of the square. For the Feast of the Veil, Daniel explained. The night when the boundary between our world and the other side is thinnest. We prepare a meal for the dead, so they remain content. Something about the way he said it made my stomach turn. Still, I smiled. I played along. Even when I saw that among the wooden plates and silverware, there was something else at the table. An empty chair, ornate, ancient, and waiting. For who? I was about to find out. And by then it would be too late. That night, I dreamed of a woman with no face. She stood at the head of the banquet table, her body wrapped in funeral shrouds. Her hands, long and skeletal, traced the wood as she moved past the empty plates. She stopped in front of the empty chair. Slowly, she turned toward me. And then a whisper. "You were chosen." I woke up gasping. Daniel was already awake, standing by the window, looking out into the dark streets. The only light came from the flickering lanterns outside, illuminating the eerie festival decorations. I sat up, rubbing my arms. The dream still clung to me like damp fabric. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. He didn't turn around. "You should stay inside tomorrow night." Something in his voice made my stomach twist. Before I could respond, the church bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. A signal. I moved to the window beside Daniel. The townspeople were gathering in the square. They were dressed in black ceremonial robes, their faces hidden beneath veils of thin white cloth. In their hands they carried bowls of raw meat, blood, and bread covered in ash. Procession. Leading them was Father Wilkes, the town priest. His robe was heavier, more ornate, and around his neck hung a pendant shaped like an open mouth. I shuddered. "What are they doing?" I whispered. Daniel's hand tightened into a fist. "They're making the offering." "To who?" He finally turned to face me. His eyes were shadowed, his face pale. "To her." I didn't need to ask who he meant. I already knew. The woman from my dream. The one who was waiting for me. The one who sat at the empty chair. The procession moved in eerie silence. Not a word was spoken as the townspeople made their way to the banquet table. The only sounds were the shuffling of feet and the occasional wet drip of blood from the bowls they carried. Daniel gripped my wrist. "Stay here." His voice was urgent, almost desperate, but I pulled away. I had to see. I followed the procession at a distance, staying in the shadows of the old houses. My breath was shallow, my pulse a steady thrum in my ears. At the head of the table, Father Wilkes raised his hands. The crowd stopped. The night was deathly still. And then, in a voice like a whisper carried through dry leaves, the priest spoke. "The veil is thin. The feast is prepared. Let her be sated." The townspeople knelt, heads bowed. The priest turned to the empty chair, and slowly he pulled it back. It scraped against the stone, a sound that sent a cold shiver through my bones. And then movement. The lanterns flickered. The air grew thick, like the pressure before a storm. My skin crawled as I felt something shift, something I couldn't see. The space around the chair bent, the darkness thickening. And then, in the flickering light, she appeared. A woman, wrapped in black funeral veils, her body long and unnaturally thin. The fabric of her shroud moved as though something was writhing beneath it. Her head slowly turned. Though I couldn't see her face, I felt her looking at me. And then she raised her hand and pointed straight at me, a slow, knowing gesture, like a mother calling her child home. And then, all at once, the townspeople turned. Their veiled faces snapped toward me in unison. I ran. But deep behind me, beneath the rustling of robes, beneath the sharp clatter of utensils against empty plates, I heard a voice, not spoken aloud, but inside my head, soft, amused. "You were chosen." I ran through the narrow streets of Grimstead, my breath ragged, my heartbeat like thunder in my ears. Behind me, the town was waking up. Doors creaked open. More veiled figures stepped into the night, emerging from their homes like shadows spilling from open graves. And at the center of it all, sitting at the great banquet table, she waited. The faceless woman, the thing behind the veil. I sprinted toward Daniel's house, but as I turned a corner, he was there, standing in the street, his face pale, his expression twisted in a mix of guilt and grief. "Daniel," I gasped. "You have to go," he whispered. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into the alleyway between two buildings. We crouched behind a stack of rotting crates as the procession passed by. The veiled figures moved in silence, their hands still clutching bowls of dark, wet meat. The priest walked at the front, his pendant swaying. And then came her. She did not walk. She glided. The air around her shimmered, bending like heat over asphalt. I pressed my hand over my mouth, willing myself to stay silent. And then she stopped, right in front of our hiding spot. Daniel's grip on my wrist tightened. I could feel his pulse, fast and erratic. She lifted one thin, skeletal hand and traced her fingers along the wall beside us. The wood beneath her touch rotted instantly, curling and blackening. The scent of decay filled my nostrils, making me gag. I wanted to run, but then she spoke. A whisper inside my head, soft as silk, cold as the grave. "I see you." The crates beside me exploded into dust. I screamed. Daniel grabbed my hand, yanking me to my feet. We ran. And behind us, the townspeople, all of them, began to follow. I wasn't meant to escape. I was meant to be the feast. We ran. Through the twisting streets of Grimstead, past darkened houses and empty, watching windows. The veiled townspeople followed silently, moving in unison, their footsteps barely making a sound. But behind them, behind all of them, she came. The thing that wore the funeral veils. The thing that had waited at the empty chair. Her presence bent the air, warped the world around her like a slow-burning fire. I felt her gaze, even though she had no face. Daniel pulled me toward the woods. "The trees will slow them down," he gasped. But as we reached the treeline, I heard the bell. Not the church bell this time. The feast bell. It rang once, and the world shifted. The stars above dimmed. The ground beneath me felt suddenly wrong. Too soft, too deep, like I was stepping into something alive. I turned to Daniel. His face was ashen, his eyes wide. He knew. The town was no longer in our world. We were inside hers. I choked back a sob. "What do we do?" Daniel turned to me, his jaw clenched. "She doesn't just take anyone," he said. "The Feast of the Veil only needs one." I didn't understand until he pushed me backward. I stumbled, falling hard onto the damp earth. "Run!" he shouted. And then he turned toward her. I screamed, scrambling to my feet, but it was too late. Daniel stepped forward and knelt at the edge of the banquet table. The veiled figures stopped chasing me. She stopped chasing me. Her head tilted, considering him, and then she reached out. A single, skeletal hand rested against his forehead. Daniel's breath hitched. His body trembled. And then he was gone. No sound.
No struggle.
Just emptiness. The veiled figures slowly turned away, their task complete. One by one, they vanished into the mist. The town itself seemed to pull away, retreating into the darkness. And then I was alone. The banquet table stood abandoned, the empty chair waiting. And somewhere, in the distance, I heard the bell one last time. The veil had closed. The feast was over. And Daniel was never coming back.